course, of course, of course.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna put my voice over some pictures, and I'm gonna be kind of describing the pictures and answering some of the questions that I have to answer. I don't.
Okay.
Okay, so is it okay if I start?
Of course.
Okay. My first question is how when you came home, how was the how were you raised differently than you would have raised Bobby, or how you've seen other people been raised? Were there different values or things that you had to live by?
Well, I shouldn't have started with well. I should start off by saying that I was born in 1934. And in 1933 is when Hitler came to power. So that's the date that we say the Holocaust began. January of 1933. So I was quite young, but my parents, of course, experienced the beginning. And the beginning was after, when they were children. I think it's important that you have this aspect of it. When they were children, it was World War I. And during World War I, there was no particular discrimination. Germany was fighting against England and Russia and America and France, and so there was really no effect directly of that war, except that immediately thereafter there was hyperinflation, which means that the value of money went way down, and there was a depression where people lost their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And then along came the Nazis, and the Nazis starting in 1925, and they started talking against people who were Jewish in the population of Germany. Germany had 65 million people living there, and 500,000 of us were Jewish, and that was less than 1%. But they told all kinds of terrible things about us, and people started believing those things, and then all the discrimination started. My parents were subject to what was called the Nuremberg Laws in 1935. That means that my mother was fired from her job because she couldn't work anymore for a non-Jewish dentist, because the Nuremberg laws didn't allow that, and many other aspects of and my father's company was taken away in 1935. He worked for his father, and they owned a company, but my grandfather had died in 1928, and so this is now 1935. In 19, and that's when I was 1 year old, and I was not in any way told at that age what was going on within Germany and with our home. As far as I was brought up in my early years, it was that I was a little boy who had doting parents and grandparents and even a great-grandmother. And to me, it was a time of playing like a child does, and visiting grandparents and those kinds of things that we were able to do. So along comes 1938, and my parents decide that the life there is not something that we can be happy with anymore, and so made arrangements to leave Germany. Now we're in 38, and we got a sponsor who was a family in America who were my mother's cousins, and they did all kinds of paperwork on our behalf. Even my mother went to pick up the paperwork. She took a boat to Germany, from Germany to America, to go to the home in Chicago of these people who then did all the paperwork that my mother asked for, because we needed people who would support us. And the family in Chicago was the family that issued the affidavit of support, and my mother hand carried it back to Germany. Now here we are in 1938, and I'm 4 years old, and along in our family comes the need to make a life change. I was told that we were going to go to America, that we were going to be taking a ship, and the ship was going to be taking about a week to get to America, and some various things happened, which I won't get into here, that helped us get out of Germany, and which were life-saving events with the man in Chicago and other people who helped us get out of Germany and get on that ship in December of 1938 from England. So here we are on the ship. I had a good time on that ship. It was kind of a fun experience. I was told in German, of course, that I would have to learn a new language, and that it was going to be a very different life that we were living in Germany. And I guess I understood what that meant as far as language was concerned. And we arrived in America, and we immediately went to the home of our our sponsor, our cousins. That particular day, our uncle told me that he had a friend that he played golf with, and that friend was going to be coming over with his 4-year-old son. And his 4-year-old son, David, and I met, and he did not know a word of German. I did not know a word of English, and we played together. That's how my life in America really began, in that December day of 1938. The family in Chicago, my parents went to work the next day. They did not anymore talk German because they chose not to. So I did not grow up after age 4 in a German-speaking household. They knew enough English and were learning more and more of it, and went to work in English, of course, in 2 different companies that they worked for. And I spent a lot of my time at the home of the sponsoring family, which was not far away from our apartment, which that family had found for us. And we lived in that apartment building and slept there. But during the day, I spent with the family, and they taught me things. They taught me how to set a table in America, which is different than setting a table in Germany. They started talking English to me so I would learn English. By 1939, September, which was only a few months away, I started kindergarten. And starting kindergarten as a new student, there was no indication by that time that I had any accent whatsoever or was any different at all than any of the other children that were in my kindergarten class. And by the way, that David person that I met at age 4 became my lifelong friend, my first friend and my lifelong friend, even though he died 1 year ago now. But then the friends that I made in kindergarten and first grade, etc., became friends even to this day.
That is very cool.
So that's the very beginning. And so I was raised as an American child in a former Holocaust survival family.
So, if I may ask questions?
Please.
So, the adjustment from Germany to America was relatively smooth for you, right?
It was relatively smooth for me, and no anti-Semitism that greeted us. We joined a Jewish congregation that was all English-speaking people. I started kindergarten there as well, and so it was only in later years, and we'll talk about that, in later years where I started being involved with telling the story. Once I started asking my parents questions about that life in Germany, and which I was then able to start speaking about. But I hadn't been asking any questions of my parents for quite a few years, and so it was a normal American grammar school life, normal American high school life, and normal American college life.
So you were raised no differently than any other kid at that age?
Any other kid that, except there were other German-speaking families where their children were raised with telling stories to their children, but more importantly, that keeping their German language alive, which my parents and at the time, rightly so, chose to do. But my grandparents arrived. And I relearned my German of all my grandparents, that one of them who lived with us and another one who lived nearby. And so I relearned my German, which I retain to this day. But there was no effect on the lifestyle, and no effect on anything else that I had come from Germany for reasons that of the terrible things that ultimately would have happened to us if we had not left and hadn't been sponsored by the American family.
Thank God for them.
Yes.
So I understand that you asked your parents questions, right? And you used to talk to them.
Well, that's just the answer is yes, but maybe almost embarrassingly, I'm going to tell you that there are Holocaust survivors as a group, and I've certainly been studying them for years and been with them for many years. Other Holocaust survivors who came over as children, and if their parents survived, because some of them, of course, the parents did not survive, and that was a whole different story, because then they didn't have any stories to tell except of their own. But those whose parents survived did not tell them anything. It was all the way till 1978, when the Nazis wanted to march in Skokie, Illinois, when Holocaust survivors started telling their stories. And then and only then did I start asking questions. So it was all the way from 1938 to 1978 that before any questions were asked and answered by my parents. And those are the stories that I now tell, but I did not ask questions during my grammar school, high school, or college, or even married years. They didn't want to talk about it, and I didn't ask any questions about it, even though I was thoroughly engaged with asking questions, and then ultimately starting to speak to schools and so on after I had learned the story.
Okay. That is so that's a relatively sensitive topic for you, or is that not sensitive, maybe more private, or not something to be talked about?
No, on the contrary. My role that I've accepted in life is telling the story. I have written the story. I have spoken on TV. I have spoken to hundreds and hundreds of schools, tens of thousands of school children, and I still do that to this day. And to people like you who are studying the subject, or I'm writing in the subject, and I'm delighted to do that. And the memories are the memories, literally, the memories that my mother, more so than my father, but the memories that my mother had. And in the meantime, when I started creating a family tree, my father helped me starting in 1949, because he had all kinds of records of all of our family members all the way back to the 1700s. And so I have a family tree which I've created that goes from the 1700s all the way to our Tyler. We have a great grandson named Tyler. You know that, right?
Yes, I do know that.
Now I know two Tylers in my life. But so the question that you asked, and I give you the long answers, unfortunately.
That's perfect.
Hopefully not. It was not until the early 80s when I freely and actively started telling the story, which I had effectively just learned. All the things happened to the family after World War I, which is after 1918, all the way to 1938, and what happened to my grandparents, what happened to my mother's brothers and sisters. One sister who didn't leave Germany and was ultimately killed in Auschwitz, and so I tell about her story that I've learned in some detail because she left not till 1943 when they picked her up and sent her to Auschwitz concentration camp, as well as my cousin, who was 10 years old when he was taken to the camp in 1943. So he would have been 1 year older than I, because he was born in 1933. And so I have no personal trouble telling the story and do it freely and without. I mean, I'm going to be speaking on Friday morning to an 8th grade group in St. Louis over Zoom. And so I do that, and I do things like we're doing here today. And I'm very much involved with the Illinois Holocaust Museum. And the most important part of that, in answer to your question, is we have a project going on right now, which is getting people to find out, however they can, whether they're Jewish or not, find out the stories of their grandparents and get it written down or recorded, because people of your age, as you probably are well aware, don't necessarily know how to ask questions and don't actively do it, think that you're going to be there. Your parents and grandparents are going to be around a long time, and there'll be plenty of time to ask questions. But then when that time goes away and the grandparents are gone, and then things started happening in your family, and you have to say, "Oh, I wish I had asked Grandma about her life. Where did she go to school? And where did she grow up? And where did she meet her husband, my grandfather, and things like that." So that's what we're doing with young people now, to get them to get the stories of their grandparents, not for us to use at the museum, more so what they need to do in order to get those stories. I should have asked questions all the way along. I should not have waited till 1978, when there was the thing going on politically, where it was important to start finding out about the Holocaust, because we in America did not really know very much about what was going on, because the families that got here didn't talk about it. And many did share their stories, but most of them did not. And so that's why I reach out now to young people to hopefully get their stories, not my story, but get their stories, so that it will be remembered in their families.
I think you answered that question perfectly, and I think you answered that question perfectly about how it's not a sensitive topic. It's more of something that needs to be talked about, because my social studies teacher, the one that I'm doing this project for, he he's the speaker at our school, and he's the one that teaches all the kids about the Holocaust, and that's kind of his specialty. And so he always says that they did something terrible. We don't need to sugarcoat it. We need to kind of fight dirty and say it how it is, and
Yes.
we can't just sugarcoat and say like soften it up kind of. You need to say it exactly how it is, like hit below the belt kind of, he says.
And I fully accept that logic, and that what he teaches, that it was a terrible time from 1933 to 1945, particularly for Jewish people and other groups that were that were killed and were imprisoned, and all the things that were done to the various groups that the Nazis hated. And those stories need to be told and need to be continued to be told and learned by students like you. And we start talking to students starting with seventh grade, but mostly eighth grade, when they come to visit the museum, and we survivors tell our stories. And every time that's going to happen in the future, I have been, and I'm going to start by making sure that they go home and say, we really, having nothing to do with the Holocaust, because most of the students there have no Holocaust connections, but just for families to know from whence they came. And so that's so I'm intent on telling the Holocaust story as it relates to my family, and intent on getting people to learn their parents' and grandparents' stories.
So you truly hope that your stories and your parents' stories get passed down forever, right?
Absolutely. And in any form. I haven't written a book per se, but my story is in a few books. And as you can tell, I get very excited about telling the story from two standpoints. One, historical, because I start the story in 1918, and even though I wasn't born until 1934, and I end the story when we got to America. And it's the same kind of questions that you ask about life in America, because that's what students that ask questions ask those kind of questions, like what happened to your aunt that was killed, and how was your life in America, and was there any anti-Semitism in your life, and I then answer those questions, like hopefully. The way I'm answering these questions are appropriate for for what you're working on.
I have another question, and if I ever get too personal, just say so, okay?
Sure.
How does it make you feel almost when a little bit ago, very recently actually, neo-Nazis were marching in the streets of Northbrook? How does that stuff make you feel? How did the Skokie marches make you feel?
Okay, that's a very good question. The Skokie March in '78 wasn't as bothersome at that particular moment, because that was a time when we were very engaged with work and families. Bobby was born in 60, and Mark was born in 57, and they were leading their lives, and so we had children, and then we were having grandchildren, and when we heard about the Skokie March, I did not as much reflect on it because of my background as a survivor, as much as those people who had suffered in the Holocaust with camps and so on, because the memory of their experiences or their parents' experiences and their grandparents' experiences, most of whom were killed, those survivors were finally confronted with a situation that was like what they had lived through before, or what they knew their parents had lived through before. And that's why they all started telling their stories, not only to their children and grandchildren, but to organizations and to writing of books and so on. So right now, when there's Nazi marches, even when in 2009, on the day that our museum was opened on April the 9th in 2010, because it's now 10 years, I was so upset that neo-Nazis were outside of where we were holding our ceremony for opening of the museum in Skokie. And that bothered me terribly, but at the same time, fortunately, there was no confrontation physically, and it made me remember back as to what I had read about and knew about what was happening back in 78 when the Nazis were marching. So it bothers me a lot. What bothers me even more than that is the incredible amount of anti-Semitism that is going on throughout the world, where those numbers are growing, those events are growing. The situations in the universities are getting worse and worse for Jewish students. The kinds of things that were going on in the 30s, even here in America, where certain neighborhoods, like in the town of Kenilworth, that there was a sign in front of it's from Evanston and then comes Kenilworth and near Wilmette, and the sign said "No dogs or Jews allowed" in the town, right there on Sheridan Road. And so those are the kind of things over the years that have bothered me almost secondhand. But I didn't as much relate it to my personal story, which was very lucky. I'm a very lucky kind of a survivor, but I certainly feel for those people whose families certainly suffered, and how they, particularly so many of our survivors who lost their grandparents and lost their parents and came ultimately here as children in the early 50s, when they got out of whatever camps, not concentration camps, but camps and places where help me with the word, when you're not adopted, but when you have no parents.
Orphan?
Orphan. Yeah, they lived in orphanages until they were able to come to America, and so and other places that they came to. My uncles from Germany went to South Africa and left their whole life in South Africa because they couldn't get sponsorship out of Germany like we got, and so they went to South Africa. Others of our family went to England and to Canada and to South America, and wherever they could get into. But we were the lucky ones because we had those cousins. And another long answer to your question about anti-Semitism and about Nazi marches.
So that's a great. Sorry. How does it make you feel, and how do you see how Germany describes the Holocaust, and how Switzerland describes the Holocaust, and how all the countries that were either on the other side or not as educated as our opinions or our viewpoints?
Great question. I have been in touch through the museum with German high school and university students. They come to us every year as interns for a year. They are taught the rudiments of what the Holocaust had been. These are people who are like your age today. I have no negative feelings toward them whatsoever because they happen to be German and happen to be living in Germany. Nor do I have any against their parents, and in some cases their grandparents or great-grandparents who may have been part of even Nazis. I think that they did a horrible thing, and they were horrible people, but I don't blame today's Germans for what happened then. I do appreciate that the German government is doing two things. One, they're providing money to Holocaust survivors. They started doing that a few years ago and continue to do that, and the people who are in need, and that's a very positive thing. Secondly, they teach about the Holocaust now, which they did not do for a long time, and they even changed the language of, there was an event on November the 9th, 1938, called Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass. In Germany, they don't teach it as Kristallnacht anymore because the word Kristall has an implication of being beautiful glass. Not just glass, but beautiful glass that was shattered. And now they call it the November Pogrom. Pogrom. Pogrom means a riot. It was a riot against everything Jewish on that one night in 1938, which we lived through. And one of the people that helped us is that a teenage girl your age was house sitting for us when we were in Berlin. Our hometown is called Gotha, and we were 6 hours away from Berlin, where we had to go to get our visas to get out of Germany. And that was the night that 30,000 men between the ages of 16 and 60 who happened to be Jewish were arrested. My father would have been arrested because he was between those ages, but the teenage girl in our home, when asked, "Where is Herr Rehbach? Where's Mr. Rehbach?" And she could have said, "Well, he's in the hotel in Berlin," and blah, blah, blah. But she didn't. She said, "I don't know." And once she said, "I don't know," and they left in disgust, she saved us. Because if she would have told where we were, they would have come to that hotel, and they would have arrested my father, and things would have ended quite differently. And then there were 3 other people in our lives that saved us. I told you there were 5, the man in Chicago and so on. But that ties into that because we were just talking about telling the stories. Fortunate part of my telling the story is combining it with talking to your grandparents and telling the story, not just historical of what happened, but what happened to us and the fact that we were saved by 5 individuals independently that saved us, and then we call them upstanders. So I talk about, when I tell the stories, and we in the museum talk about the word upstander, which is different from a bystander. Bystanders are people just stand by and watch things happen. Here in America, to say nothing of everywhere else, so we want everyone to become an upstander, particularly with all these anti-Semitic things that are going on, and all the people who deny that the Holocaust ever happened. That you can't change their minds, but you can certainly ignore them because you can't change their minds. And so that's another connection with the idea of what can be done now in the telling of the stories, and how that can relate to daily lives of young people, totally separate from the Holocaust, but the message of the Holocaust, or the memories of the Holocaust, can tie into the how people react to anti-Semitism and teaching children who don't know anything about what anti-Semitism means or is, teaching them that it is going on. It's not just at the Holocaust, which ended in 1945, but still to this day, people are being blamed for the Holocaust, and people are being told that are being discriminated against because they happen to be Jewish.
So, can I go back to earlier when you said that the German students come to you for a year? Do they ever share their knowledge of what happened or their point of view from it?
Yes, absolutely. We have them write their story. We have them tell their story to the students, particularly when a survivor does not show up to an established session. They tell their stories. And the best part of the stories is how different they feel at that moment they're telling the story about being there in the museum and being involved with us survivors, because they have never individually met a survivor. All they know about is what they learn in school, that on such and such a date Hitler came to power, and then they talk a little bit about the Nuremberg laws, and they talk a little bit about Kristallnacht or the November pogrom. Those are the things that they learn about, but they certainly don't learn about suffering, and they only learn about a little bit about the camps and the fact that 6 million Jews and millions of others were killed. Not too much stress on that. And so I have one of our interns who's now in college, and the other one who's in medical school, and one is law school. And those three people keep in touch, and they have learned so much by being involved with us in the museum that they can do a better job of talking to their fellow students who don't know very much and who tell their experiences here in Skokie, and the fact that they're very good friends with people who were survivors, and those survivor relationships continue, and they are being taught, but now students in Germany are being taught what goes on, Austria and in Germany, of what went on, but very generally, and they don't spend a lot of time on the subject.
So, would you equate this to how kind of the South teaches the Civil War and how Germany teaches the Holocaust? Is that kind of like the same
Absolutely.
Concept?
Very, very, very much the same. Even the fact that the Jim Crow laws in the South, which were after the Civil War, the Jim Crow laws, which kept African Americans or Negroes, as they were called, blacks, what they could do and what they couldn't do, and the fact that there were separate the bathrooms and separate park benches and separate swimming pools and separate restaurants and separate bus seating, all those things that were part of the Jim Crow laws. But in Germany, the Nuremberg laws were exactly modeled after the Southern Jim Crow laws. The same things about park benches and swimming pools and riding bicycles and restaurants and clubs, all those things that were done in the South that they don't talk about very much, but and some of those things, of course, have changed, but the ideas of how they teach what happened in the 1860s, they teach it quite differently than we know about it in the North, and that's very much the same. And you've asked that question that nobody has ever asked me before. So, Tyler, I'm so proud of you for making that connection. But it is very much the same. What German, what was going on in Germany and what was going on in the South, and how those stories were told differently in Germany and in the South, at least for many, many years. At least the straight story is being more told today in the North. I mean, in Germany, probably more so than the stories that or what children learn in today in the South here.
So this next question is gonna sound extremely weird. Have you ever been kind of told that you were wrong and that the Holocaust just wasn't you're like exaggerating it, or that it was never a thing, or anything like that?
I personally have not been confronted by anybody who was a Holocaust denier. I have read a lot about people who are Holocaust deniers, and I know there's a lot of them, and a lot of the denial is on the social media. So I'll tell you a story about that. A few years ago, 2 years ago, Germany, the claims conference in Germany set out to have survivors of the Holocaust do 30-second videos of their real-life experiences in the Holocaust and send that video back to them in Germany and have Germany pass it on to Mr. Zuckerberg of Facebook to please, Mr. Zuckerberg, take down the Holocaust denial, and don't accept any more Holocaust denial postings. And lo and behold, a few months ago, all those thousands of videos were presented, along the way, and were shown and were posted. And Zuckerberg has since then issued an edict that Holocaust denials should no longer be accepted as postings on Facebook. So that's something that has been accomplished, and yes, they do exist. There are deniers around, and they are free, with freedom of speech, they're free to say those things. There's a professor at Northwestern by the name of Professor Butts. He did not teach about denial, but he was a denier, and he put it online constantly, but never in the classroom. A Professor Epstein was also a professor at Northwestern. He started telling his story, his concern about Professor Butts and what Professor Butts was writing. And Professor Epstein, was fired from Northwestern for having done that. But Professor Butts, for not talking about it in the classrooms, was not fired.
So let me get this. Professor Butts was the one that was the Holocaust denier.
Yes.
But Professor Epstein got fired.
He got fired for talking about Professor Butts's denial in his own classrooms, yes.
Okay. So was Professor Epstein a denier or no?
No. He was not. He was Jewish, and he just couldn't stand what Professor Butts was saying. But unfortunately, the university came down on him for having spoken of Butts' denial in his classroom, whereas Professor Butts never talked about his denial he wasn't teaching it in his classes. He was only writing it and teaching it to the world through social media and through the internet.
So do you agree with that transaction that happened?
No, I really don't think that Epstein should have been fired. He should have been talked to and told to not do it anymore. But I don't know about firing. That I probably don't accept. And they were, I think they were both engineering professors. having nothing to do with history or anything else. So he was just getting out of his element, I guess, and that's why he was let go. Or maybe he was told that if you don't stop saying it, you will be fired. But he was fired along the way, yes.
So my last question, and one of the most important ones, in my opinion, is there any values that you live by, or was there any lessons that were? Is there a lesson that you directly took from your whole experience? Is there any direct lesson or correlation to you now?
Absolutely.
May I ask what it is, or?
Yes. I have spent most of my years since the 1980s, or all of my years since the 1980s, talking about the Holocaust, talking about how important it is for the stories to be remembered, talking about people's Holocaust experiences, about the history of the Holocaust. All those things are very important to me and are involved in my daily in my daily lives as I'm an officer of the museum. I'm a vice president. I'm in charge of the Heritage Committee, which talks about people's stories and history and understanding the histories and keeping the histories alive forevermore within the museum, which we hope will exist forevermore. And so there's no question that I've devoted my life to teaching about my family and teaching about the Holocaust, and particularly putting the emphasis on people being upstanders and not bystanders, and to keep those stories alive, and for the being upstanders in their daily lives, and of course not believing any of the stories they might read about denial, because the Holocaust did happen, and millions of people were killed because during the Holocaust, and because of the hatred of Jews and homosexuals and people who are handicapped and Jehovah's Witnesses and those groups that were also discriminated against, and just for understanding of today's children that they not only the Jews were persecuted, but others were as well, because of the hatred that the Nazis. And why did there are so many people that believed the Nazis and still believe the Nazis today? Is because of their stories of the lies that the Nazis were told so many times and in so many ways. There was no TV at the time, but there were newspapers, and there were charts, and there were all kinds of things that were posted on the streets, and people started believing what they were hearing from Hitler and Hitler's cronies, and that's how so many people became members of the Nazi Party, and then ultimately even those that were not part of the party were drafted, and they had to fight and do the things that they were ordered to do. So some believed in what they were doing. Some say they were just following orders, but they certainly did not resist the orders and walk away. So that's my answer to is my life devoted and has been for all these years since the 80s, and I guess that's 40 years. For the last 40 years of my 86 years, I've spent in keeping the story, our personal story, and the history of the Holocaust, and keeping it hopefully alive forevermore. It can never be forgotten.
So when I was talking to Bobby today, he said that I asked him the same question. He said that the biggest thing that he learned from the Holocaust is that to be an upstander, not a bystander. Now, do you think that the Chicago man, the 13-year-old girl, and the three other people, do you think they were upstanders and not bystanders?
You mean the 5 people that saved us?
Yes.
Oh yeah. The third, I think she was probably older than 13, but she was probably about closer to your age. But wait, how old are you now?
I'm 13 years old.
Oh, 13. Okay, but she may be 15 or 16. But in any case, those upstanders, did they know they were upstanders? No, but they knew that they were doing the right thing. The man in Chicago knew he was doing the right thing to take care of us. But I'll tell you the end of his story. When he was in his 80s, because he did this when he was in his 30s, that he did all the paperwork for us, and we would have not gotten out of Germany. We would have never gotten into America if it hadn't been for him. That had nothing to do with getting out of Germany. But getting into America was because of that paperwork. When he was in his 80s, he sat down with me one day and he said, Ralph, I have been losing sleep. I have been thinking for so many years now about the fact that your family needed help. They were our cousins, you were our cousins, and we helped. If I had only known what was going on, I could have saved thousands. But I only saved your family. So he just regretted that there was nothing being taught or told here in America in those early years of the Holocaust that would have allowed him to help. And he was terribly bothered by the fact that he just didn't know and that he didn't help others. The girl did the right thing by saying, I don't know. The next person was a Marine guard who helped us at the embassy when it was closed on the 11th of November. Even though we were supposed to get our visas on the 10th. We got there on the 10th, which was the next morning. The next morning after the 9th, Kristallnacht. And he did not. And we got there the 11th. It was the embassy was closed because it was Veterans Day, which at that time used to be called Armistice Day. But being Veterans Day, Armistice Day, he said, we're closed today. We said we were told to come back today. And on the morning of the 11th, because we had not finished our paperwork on the 10th. And he went into the town of Berlin and got the ambassador to come back to the embassy to open the gate for us, to let us in and bring our family, my mother, my father, and I in. And he finished our passports or our visas to get out of or to get into America. And that's how we got out of Germany. And then the 5th person was a stranger at the train station where we were trying to cross from Germany to the next country over, which was Holland. And if we got into Holland, we would have been free. And he told us a way of getting to a local train that gets us into Holland rather than waiting with the other Jews that were waiting for another train. But the other train may have taken us to it was my mother and I. And my father had already gotten to England to wait for us. But this man took it upon himself to save our family of 2, my mother and I, to get us into Holland. Whereas we had stayed with the guys with the guns that had told us to wait for the next train, we might not have gotten out of Germany at all. And he was an upstander. He might not have thought in his mind that he was an upstander, but he certainly knew that he was doing something right. But he couldn't do it for all the hundreds of people that were waiting at that train station. But he happened to pick my mother and I out of the crowd and whispered to us and told us to follow him in another direction, and we were out of Germany. So those were the 5 people.
That is a great story. So the 5 people that helped you were the girl, the man in Chicago, the guard.
In the other order. First the man in Chicago.
Then the girl.
Then the Marine Guard. Then the ambassador. And then the stranger at the train station.
That is a great sequence of events that had to happen. That is truly amazing.
Well, it is, and I certainly am pleased to be able to tell that story as a way of getting across the idea of being an upstander. But it's true. It's how we got out, and we say it's how the five I've written about the 5 people who saved us. I can't talk about being in a camp. I can't talk about escaping from a camp. I can't talk about surviving from a camp as other survivors are able to do. But I am able to tell the build-up story and the idea of the 5 strangers, and not the 5 strangers, but the 5 upstanders, to get my the meaningful story. That's what allows me to tell the story, because if I didn't have that kind of ending to it, I wouldn't have had the encouragement to start at the beginning and give a little history lesson before getting to the point of what happened in December of 38. I would have been able to, because I start my story back in 1918, so I really tell what happened in our family for those 20 years, from 1918 to 1938. I can't speak of what happened after 38 when the war began in 39 and ended in 45, except being very sorry for what happened in those later years.
I want to thank you for the interview today very much. It is.
Well, I thank you for asking, and if there's something that you ultimately write, I would be delighted to get a story, get a copy of it if you're willing to do that. And it's been my honor, Tyler, to and your questions were absolutely fantastic, wonderful, and meaningful. And I hope I didn't drag on too long for any answer to each of the questions.
It was perfect, Mr. Rabach. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the call.
Wait, are you in? I have a question though.
And I have a wife and 2 sons and 6 grandchildren and 3 great grandchildren. Very happily to report all of that.
Ralph Rabach, 1934.
Yes.
Thank you so much.